Hey, what's going on? Welcome to AngularAir. I'm your host, Justin, and on today's episode, we are going to be diving into remote data fetching and API integration in Angular. Super excited to get into our content, as always. So let's say hi to our panelists, and then we'll meet our guests, and then we'll dive into it. Joining us today, we've got Bonnie. Bonnie, what is going on?
Hey, I'm so glad you're back. I was so nervous last week. I forgot to do the hey. I was trying to do the whole show without you. It was just, I'm so glad you're back, Justin. We missed you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thanks for covering. I appreciate it a lot. And, hey, it's your moment, so you can do your thing. It doesn't have to be the hey thing. It can be whatever you want it to be. So,
I know, but I really like the hey thing.
All right. Sounds like the
I'm just glad you're back.
Thank you. Well, thanks again for covering. I appreciate it a lot.
Anytime.
Alyssa's with us. Alyssa, how's it going?
So glad to be here. Hello, everyone.
You look like a cat burglar, Alyssa, with your black background and your black jacket. You look very cool.
I'm always going for. If you can go for one look, cat burglar.
You've got some noise insulation back there on the walls. I like it. Got that professional studio going. Maybe I need to up my game. I don't know. Or green screen or something. I don't know. Nice. Mike's with us. Mike, how's it going?
Not too bad. Just gotta find that mute button because nobody wants to listen to me when I'm not talking. Wait, then I guess I'm not making noise. I don't know. It's good to be here.
Awesome. We're good to have you. So we got
Happy Friday.
Let's say hi to our guest, Tanmai. Tanmai, how's it going?
Hey, everybody. Super happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's so good to see you again, Tanmai.
Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you.
Bonnie, do you want to, why is it good to see him again? Was he on something else?
So I had Tanmai on because I heard about what he was working on and I thought it was really cool, and I'd never heard of him before, and I just reached out to him and I said, hey, can you come on the show and show us what you were doing? And he said, yeah, sure. So he came on the show. So the first time I ever met him was on NG Houston. And he was cool, and we had so much fun. He was hilarious. I just thought he was going to do a he did. It was, so first of all, the code was really cool, but also I was just laughing the whole time. He was, I'm just going to shut up and let him go. You guys are going to love him.
Thanks. Thank you, Bonnie.
And you've been busy since then too. That's been 2 years ago, Tanmai. So you've got lots of community stuff that they need to know about.
This is true. Yeah. I can launch into a quick introduction whenever we're ready with the whole history of things that have been up to over 2 years. Every time you're in a startup, it feels like last week has had as much activity as 1 year. It's crazy. It's in a mostly a good way. So
I can't wait to see what you've been working on.
Manage it, right? Manage all the complexity and stress coming inbound. Yeah. For sure.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, you want to tell our viewers a bit about yourself, introduce yourself, and
absolutely
give them a rundown?
Absolutely. Once again, super happy to be here, folks, and hope everyone's keeping safe and doing well and keeping sane. I'm Tanmai. I'm one of the co-founders. I'm the CEO at Hasura. I started Hasura just about 2.5 years ago from technology that came out of a previous company that I'd started, where we were building, this kind of data access layer so that we wouldn't have to kind of do the same work over and over again. And that's kind of been the theme for most of the work that I've done kind of all my life. I specialized in machine learning and computer vision from kind of a academic point of view, did my bachelor's and master's. But then I did this hard pivot into kind of systems, because this idea of creating technology and being a part of this movement that helps people build things and that makes it easier to build things and takes away kind of repetitive stuff, takes away stuff that requires just this unnecessary expertise was something that was very close to my heart. Before even kind of the Hasura technology and this and that came along, I taught this MOOC on this online course on application development. We built something kind of like I don't know if you folks are familiar with Glitch or Code Sandbox now, right? Built out kind of a first version of that and this early version of Kubernetes, running on the 700 core cluster where people could come in online and write code and whatnot. And that course, like I think we got like 250,000 students in a year or something. Became the largest course in the world, and it was one of the most kind of amazing moments of my life. I was like, I can retire now. I have, this is all of the impact that I've ever wanted. This is amazing, right? Like, because even now when I sometimes talk to people, they're like, hey, I got into web development because of that course. And I'm like, what? That's insane. Thank you. And it's one of the most incredible feelings. But that kind of like drive and motivation kind of resulted in, me banding together with kind of my co-founders and the folks and the team and the people at Hasura to start kind of working on tech that helps kind of create, those abstractions and there's layers of infrastructure that will kind of simplify stuff, right? So that so more people can do more useful things. That's kind of how I got into Hasura and started Hasura. But does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. It's an awesome journey. Love hearing about it, for sure.
But yeah, and so I think I thought today, I'd love to talk about you talk a little bit about kind of GraphQL and my journey as being a skeptic, a GraphQL skeptic, and then starting to like gradually fall in love with GraphQL and what that was like, and then of course Hasura is an open source project that uses GraphQL quite extensively. Would love to talk about that a little bit. And also, introduce folks who are kind of who are watching this to a little bit of GraphQL and to a little bit of kind of some of the ideas that we have with at Hasura and with GraphQL. So I thought we could start the conversation there and then move into kind of more advanced data fetching things that are going to be super interesting to discuss. I think, especially in the Angular ecosystem, but just broadly in the front end ecosystem as well.
That sounds awesome. I think we're all excited for sure.
Awesome. All right. So in that case, Justin, if you let me share my screen, I shall pop a screen up. Can you folks see?
Yep.
All right, cool. So we'll kind of dive into Hasura and GraphQL a little bit through and nothing better than a live demo and a quick prayer to the demo gods that nothing drops down and falls over. But what I'll hopefully introduce to you over the next few minutes is kind of how Hasura works, which is this idea of being able to get instant real-time GraphQL in a way that's useful. And one of those key things that's important to make instant real-time GraphQL useful or GraphQL API useful is authorization, because otherwise you're just getting access to all of your data. It's not really secure, which is probably a bad idea. So maybe, I don't know, unless you're Cambridge Analytic or something. But otherwise, this is kind of that's what I thought we'd start with. And so let me dive straight into a demo. I'm going to use Heroku for doing a demonstration, but you can kind of run Hasura wherever you want. You can.
Hey, Tanmai, before you get into the technical stuff, you're talking really fast.
I shall slow down.
Because I understand everything, but I've had people fuss at me before because I also talk very fast, especially when I get excited. And then people say it's crazy, so just slow down.
This is true. And also, as a person who is 100% excited all the time, it is.
I know.
This is definitely a problem.
I have that same issue. I'm always excited.
and if I'm going
I want everyone to follow you because I think this is really exciting what you're fixing to show us. I already know about it and I love it. So
awesome, thank you. All right, and if I'm speaking too fast or I'm not being easy to understand, please do let me know and I shall do the things. But
we will.
That said, I am going to show you Hasura deployed on Heroku. So Hasura kind of runs anywhere, right? You can run it on your laptop. You can run it on a cloud vendor, right? Wherever you want. So I am going to deploy this on Heroku to get started because one of the nice things about Heroku is that they let you deploy stuff for free. And see, this screen is not something that I've seen before, but I'm just going to go ahead and hit accept, and hopefully things work. So thank you, Heroku. Well, let's see. Let me try deploying to Heroku again. But I'm deploying to Heroku because Heroku is a nice place to deploy stuff for free and get stuff and try stuff out. But one of the other nice things on Heroku is that you get a free Postgres database. I still think that I think Heroku is probably one of the best places to get like a free instance of trial instance of a database. So if you're like trying out databases and learning about databases, Heroku is probably one of the best places. But that said, let me create an app here called Angular on Air. Look at that. There's nobody else with that name. And so what I'm doing here is I'm asking Heroku to deploy a Postgres database for me. And so you can see that, right? That's going to be the database. That's going to be our backend database. And I'm also asking Heroku to deploy a Hasura kind of GraphQL engine container for me. So that runs as a Docker container. And we use the one-click button to basically kind of pass Heroku this instruction that, give us a Postgres database, give us a Docker container. And that's kind of our app name here. This is deployed. And so let me look at that. So what you're going to see now and what pops up here is what we call the Hasura console. So, and that's going to be our GraphQL endpoint. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit just so you can see the GraphQL endpoint. So that's the GraphQL endpoint, right? And that's kind of where we'll be making GraphQL queries, right? And where we'll be trying GraphQL out. And this kind of UI here is basically what we're going to use to configure our GraphQL backend. And so the way to think about where Hasura is in your stack is instead of you building a GraphQL server entirely from scratch, Hasura is your GraphQL server that allows you to pull in different data sources, like your database, REST APIs, other GraphQL APIs, and Hasura kind of puts them together in that unified GraphQL API for you. And I'm using the UI to configure whatever I do, but every single thing that I do on the UI can also be done, in a IDE, in a JSON file, and then you can commit it to Git and have like a CI/CD workflow and all of those things as well. So with that, let me just give you a quick 30-second introduction into what this looks like. So I'm going to head to the data tab, which helps me kind of look at my databases. And I'm going to go create a database, a table here. And that's an ID, it's a name. ID is the primary key, just fine, just standard database stuff, right? And then let me go in here and say, oh, hey, Justin. And if I do that, what I can do is I get a GraphQL API and I can start querying that. So let me go say ID and name, and I get that result, right? And if I just fetch ID, I get this result. So that's the kind of quick 30-second demo to what Hasura is doing, right? And I'll segue a little bit into describing kind of the GraphQL setup for those of you who might not be familiar with GraphQL. The idea is that it's kind of very similar to whatever API you would have, right? Like in over HTTP, you might have like a REST API. If you're unfortunate, you might have an XML API with SOAP, right? And all of these things are basically kind of specifications for how you can start using data from your API, right? And so one of these kind of more modern specifications is GraphQL. It's not and the kind of problems that GraphQL ends to desires to solve is that you want to be able to make it easier for the people who are using the API to fetch data. And we look at a few examples there. But there's no black magic. There's nothing great that's happening with GraphQL, right? That's our API endpoint. And instead of having an API endpoint that would have, in a REST world have been something like /v1/users, right? And then you would have had a GET request there and that would have returned some JSON data to you. Instead of that, what we're doing is we're making a post request and we post this query. So if I do an inspect element and if I look at the dev tools in the network tab, you'll see that this GraphQL query is being sent as a post request body, right? And the interesting thing about GraphQL and the kind of pros and cons about GraphQL, some of the pros and cons about GraphQL kind of really stem from the fact that GraphQL is this whole new language, right? It's it looks nice, right? You're saying, hey, query users ID, that's cool. It's super intuitive, right? Oh, I want name as well. Let me add name here, right? And it's kind of like the shape of the JSON that you want, right? It's brilliant. It's nice. It's a nice API. I can do mutations as well. So I can be like, hey, mutation, insert user, and let me just insert one user and say, name, and say Bonnie, right? And say whatever, return the ID here. And so I can run a mutation as well. This is the equivalent of a post request in REST, right? And the nice thing about GraphQL is that it looks nice, right? It's a very fairly intuitive kind of spec to understand. The thing that's terrible about GraphQL is that it's a new language, right? It's an entirely new language, right? It's not a thing that's been there before. It's not like JSON, right? It's this new language. It's this entirely new specification, right? So if I go back to a query here, and I run this, right? It's an entirely new thing, and that means, and that kind of has a lot of complexities around, well, how should clients work and how should servers work, right? Something needs to parse this to understand the format of this thing, right? If you had to parse this string, you could just do a JSON.stringify, or JSON.load, or a JSON.stringify, or whatever, right? But with GraphQL, you need the equivalent of that again, right? And then you need to have kind of ways of creating GraphQL queries and handling GraphQL queries and things like that. So there is a tooling overhead that comes in, right? Because you have a new language, but hopefully that cost is worth it because you have a nice API. So
can we take a quick step back? Because a lot of things just happened in the last 10 minutes.
Dense.
So you set up a new environment called AngularAir, and in doing so, you stood up an API endpoint that'll listen to this GraphQL post that you can do different GraphQL things, which we'll dive more into, it seems like. But you're also standing up a database. And you're able to configure and manage that database through your UI. Now, is this intended environment supposed to be something as a playground? Is this an environment that could be utilized as a production environment? What's the understanding of the environment that got spin off through this tool?
Yep, that's a very good question, right? And I'll add kind of more meat to the statements that I'm going to make now over the next 10 minutes. But our intention as an open source project and as a startup around this open source project is that Hasura is kind of wherever you have data, right? Whether it's new or existing data. And I'm showing you a demo with Postgres, but this could have been MySQL, this could be SQL Server, right? Wherever you have this data and you want to kind of activate that data, meaning you want to use that data to build applications or to provide APIs to people, we want Hasura to be that solution for you, right? We don't want you to spend 3 quarters or a year or 2 years building this out, right? And that's kind of where Hasura fits in, right? So for just to give you a few examples, right? One of the world's largest self-driving electric car companies is a Hasura user, right? I mean, lots of guesses on who that could be, but and for them, for example, it's they spend 2 quarters in building an internal cost management system, an inventory system, right? And they want to use GraphQL to provide a flexible API to their applications, and they had a lot of internal data. So instead of spending that time building that out, they kind of stick Hasura in front of it. Another example is one of these kind of healthcare enterprise type folks. They have MRI machines all over the world, and there's a lot of data there that they want to extract and they want to use. They can stick a Hasura in front of all of these MRI machines so that they can start taking that data out. And now they can attach applications to that. They can have other APIs. They can have APIs that are being consumed by other services or serverless functions or by third-party developers, right? So wherever you kind of need a GraphQL API, and generally you end up needing a GraphQL API when your application is fairly data intensive. There's lots of data models. There's lots of different. There's hundreds of data models. There's billions of rows, right? There's lots of relationships in that data, right?
Did we lose him? Oh no. Is it just me?
I don't. Yeah, I'm wondering that too. Did I freeze?
I'm gonna do this.
Tanmai freeze
if it comes through.
Wait till he comes back.
I know. I don't want to talk about Hasura without him. Oh my goodness, this thing is incredible though.
From what I'm understanding is it's like that layer of what Hasura is doing is that layer of identifying I want to connect these different sources and provide GraphQL to do that and manage it from this console thing. Like it began with setting up the database solution, right, in there and launching a database and then activating the GraphQL part of it and then starting to provide this UI for configuring that.
Yeah, but the point that he
I told you were going to like that
I want
guy.
him to come back. Hopefully he comes back here.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be just the local database that he's creating. It seems like you'd be able to attach this GraphQL front end onto any of your data stores.
Right,
I mean,
and
there's going to be a level of configuration there to be able to expose access to your data store to this GraphQL API, but it seems rather powerful.
Hey, folks.
Hey, welcome back.
Hey, welcome back.
We missed you. We were so worried.
I just kept speaking to my computer, right? I'm like, yeah, I don't care. I don't care. Put me on an island with my laptop. I'll speak to my laptop. That was. I'm so sorry. Where did you folks lose me?
We don't know. It was just so cool and fast, and there was a lot going on.
I think you're talking about the solution for having this in there for not having to wire up all the other or manage all the other stuff, and you just kind of get this.
You're talking about the MRI machines.
Yes, I was talking about the MRI machines. All right,
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah, that's exactly right. So, for example, right, like Bonnie said, there are these MRI machines that have all of your MRI scan stuff, and somebody wants to use that to build stuff off.
Will you turn your screen share back on, Tanmai?
Yeah, of course. And let me share my screen here as well, and let me keep rambling too. So,
and while you're doing that, Rares wanted to know about what was the question? How much you can personalize queries and mutations too, if you can cover that while you're in there.
Yep. I'll come to that. I'll come to that example as well. But that's kind of where Hasura fits in, and for us, it's really important that like all of these kinds of use cases where you have that data that you want to use, and you need a layer of authorization to make that happen, which is what I'm going to talk about. But especially if it's like mission critical stuff, right? You have like hundreds of tables or hundreds of data models, you have billions of rows, right? You have terabytes of data. That takes a lot of time to use and a lot of time to kind of like, start extracting and using. And that's kind of where, that's kind of where Hasura fits in. So on that note of kind of talking about an existing database, let me show you what Hasura on an existing database looks like. So for doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to my database directly, which is here. All right, that's the database, right? That's the database that Heroku gave me. And now let me go to my terminal. I'm going to bump that up. All right. So that's the database, right? And I'm connecting directly to the database. So that's the table that I had inside the database, right? What I'm going to do is to simulate kind of this scenario where we have an existing database. Is I'm going to take this data dump that I have. It's like a backup, right? And I am going to import that here. All right, and just to show you folks the database that I'm importing and what it looks like, let me go to my screen here. Right, and so that's the database that I'm importing. It's a music database. It has artists and albums and tracks and stuff like that. And that's the standard demo database that I use. And so that's the database that I'm importing. And yeah, you can see that the data is getting inserted as well, right? So what I'm going to do is move to the right screen. That's kind of important. And if I go to the data tab, right, what Hasura is going to show me is Hasura tells me, you have some data models in your database. Do you want to expose them? Do you want to use that to kind of bootstrap your GraphQL models? And I'm all for it. So I'm going to say track all of them, right? And so what Hasura is doing now is Hasura is basically, it's doing this kind of introspection, right? It goes and talks to the database, understands the types there, right? Creates the entire kind of GraphQL schema on the fly, right? Automatically. Hasura is kind of like this compiler or build system that's running as a web server, and everything about it is dynamic, as opposed to you compiling and building a schema. Hasura just does everything via APIs. And so now I've kind of got those models. Then Hasura kind of prompts me and says, well, there are these foreign keys also. Are they kind of hints of relationships, or what's the scene? And I'm like, yes, all of them are actually relationships. They don't have to be. Often in production databases, you won't have foreign key constraints because you have performance issues, right? You have indexing issues or performance issues where you won't want to enforce them. Or you might have a join condition that is very peculiar. It's not a mapping of like a column to a column or two columns to two columns, right? And in those cases, you can specify that kind of join condition yourself. But I'm just bootstrapping this right now. And so now when I do this.
So I have something real quick. I would imagine, and it's kind of like the lower level stuff as you get in more of the details of GraphQL and stuff. My assumption would be that because GraphQL is strongly typed and can be strongly typed, that probably played a big benefit here to be able to do what you're doing here in terms of reading the database, understanding the types, and then figuring out how to automatically map that. Because I'm assuming that's what all is happening behind the scenes, right? Is the automatic mapping of building the GraphQL representation of that. And because it's strongly typed, GraphQL supports strongly typed stuff, then you're able to do that kind of connection and understand that engineering part.
Exactly, right. So so back in the day, we did not. So when we first built Hasura, we built that first version of Hasura before there was GraphQL, and at that time it wasn't called Hasura and it wasn't launched and whatnot, right? But that core tech was similar, and we had our own version of GraphQL that we called RQL, which was essentially kind of like a JSON API in GraphQL. So it was like you would have like type read. Right, I'm just going to write stuff here, and I don't know what it's going to say, right? But whatever, type read, and then you'd have like fields, and that'd be an array of what you want, right? So you'd be like, I want artists, and I want within artists, I want ID, and I want name, right? And I'd have like fields, and then I'd have ID and name, and you can already see that this is horrendous, right? Like this is a bad API. You don't want this API. Look at that previous API that I had. It's so nice. I can fetch artists and ID and name, and then I have albums and ID and title. That's a neat API, right? And so we switched that front end to GraphQL. And you're absolutely right. That kind of creating that type system of the API and inferring that from the models that you have, but also from queues that the user provides, right? And then we get into customization in a bit, right? The queues that the user is providing on how they want to customize this API. We kind of take those queues, we take the database types itself, and I have one database here, but I can have two databases at the same time. I can have a database plus a REST API or another GraphQL service, right? And so I can kind of bring all of those things in together and create another unified type system on top of that, right? And that's kind of what Hasura is doing underneath it. And that type system really helps, right? It really helps also because you kind of get to browse this, right? Like right now I'm fetching, like 300 elements, right? And it's pretty fast. Especially if you kind of benchmark this against something else. What you're seeing here is primarily network latency. And the reason is because what Hasura is doing really is it's compiling that into into a single kind of database query, right? Whenever Hasura detects that a part of this GraphQL query can be serviced by a single data source, right? It'll do the best thing that's possible on the data source. Sometimes the best thing that's possible is making multiple API calls, and that's fine, right? Because it's coming from two different sources. But sometimes when it's coming from the same source, you don't need to hit the same source again. You don't need to be like, oh, give me all the artists, and then give me all the albums, and then let me put that all together, right? That's really, really slow. For example, if you run this query on a server that you build and you benchmark it, you will notice about a 50x difference from what you're seeing, which is a little bit mind blowing. But this is kind of one part of this, and the other part of GraphQL is that it makes stuff like this convenient. Like I can say I want artists where the album has let me say artist where album title has the word rock in it, right? So I want all of those artists which have at least one album that has the word rock in it, right? And I can make queries like that. And I get AC/DC and Deep Purple because they have like Deep Purple and rock and whatnot, right? So Iron Maiden, whatnot. Interesting music database. But those kinds of things are like easy, and right, it's so easy to browse this API, right? Which is kind of this other benefit of GraphQL in the way that the syntax is structured. This is such a kind of simple query to make, right? Imagine this in the REST style, right, where you'd be like /artists, question mark albums dot title dot, like it's weird, right? You'd have to come up with the syntax yourself, right? And then how would you say that, oh well, you know what, I want only like the first 5 artists, right? And then you have to layer that in. And then when I want the albums, I don't want 10 albums per person. I want like 2 albums per result, right? And so you want this, but for AC/DC you want 2. You want 10 if AC/DC has 10, right? Or if Deep Purple has 10 albums, you don't want 10 albums. You just want the first 2, right? The syntax for this on a REST API would be cumbersome, and it's really easy with GraphQL, right? And so that's kind of one of those nice things.
One of the little nuances of that too is that if you're doing a GET request in REST, now you also have to encode all those query parameters, right?
Yes,
so when you talk
exactly.
about the string of rock or whatever, we have different special characters. In a REST GET call, you have to encode those for the URL.
Encode all those parameters, exactly.
Right? And then your example of the limit, you have like 2 limits, right? So now how do you in a REST API say, hey, what, do I name this limit 1 and limit 2? There's a lot of complexity to try and work with the URL structure at that point, whereas this frees you from that and makes it less,
So I have a question that might be super noobish, and you can let me know, but so you, like the last example that you just created, that query that you built out, it was super easy, but at least in my mind right now, we're just dabbling with the data. We're not like saving that query to use later. Like, how do you, like, is it just up to the developer to like take said chunk and use it, or is there somewhere in Hasura to put that, or what happens?
That's a really good question. We'll come to that in just a second, but I wanted to quickly touch upon another small thing with GraphQL called subscriptions, and then we can talk a little bit about kind of what really happens when you're using this in production in an app, right? Like what do you do? Is that like a query? Do you save that on Hasura or something, and then how do you embed that inside your application or something, right? So just before I get to that question, what I wanted to show you also was, for example, the API that Hasura creates, it allows for you to kind of do aggregations as well, right? So for example, here I have I have these artists and albums have tracks, right? And when I query the total number of tracks, you can see that this number changes, right? And that's because I'm still inserting data here. Because the data is kind of getting inserted here, you'll see that, man, I don't understand why multiple desktops are hard, but you will see that this data is changing, right? Every time I run this query, because I'm still importing that data set that I had running in the background. So what I can do is convert this to a subscription. And I'm gonna zoom that up a little bit so that you folks can see too, right? But now you're seeing that data kind of change live, right? This is kind of like in the REST world. Imagine that you had like GET, which was the queries, and I showed you a mutation, which is kind of like a post. And now imagine a watch, right? Like a GET, but a watch, right? So it's like I can subscribe to a resource or changes to a resource, right? And I'm getting that over WebSockets or whatever. But as a developer, that experience is so nice, right? It's like I don't care. There is a data model. The data model is changing. Let me just subscribe to it, right? And it's a nice intuitive kind of experience to be able to subscribe to those changes, right? And because GraphQL is a standardized specification, your GraphQL clients that you use can have that WebSockets work done underneath it. So that as a developer, you're not even worried about WebSockets. You're like, oh, cool, yeah, GraphQL server, it supports subscriptions. That's great. Let me see what I can subscribe to. And then you kind of open up the subscription thing. You hit control space. You see all of the things that you can subscribe to, right? So for example, let me subscribe to, like, I want to subscribe to a user where the ID is 1, right? And I want to get their ID and name. And so I can I can browse the schema of, whatever is available to subscribe to. And here, for example, I'm subscribing to this entity called Justin. Let me go change that data now, right? And so, all right, so you can see that I've subscribed to this, and now let me go to users, right? And I'm going to change this to capital J, or let me just capitalize the whole thing, right? Just sitting, but also Justin. And if I do that, you'll see that this kind of changes here immediately, right? And the Hasura specific magic here is that Hasura has got this nice integration with the database that makes this efficient, right? We've done kind of these benchmarks to make sure that you can scale to like millions of subscriptions on changes and this and that, right? And that's great. But the convenience here is, as a user, you're like, oh, cool, I can subscribe to stuff. That means I can build like reactive and real-time portions in my UI, and that's super convenient. And so that's kind of the subscription space. So we did queries, we did mutations, and mutations can do inserts and updates and deletes, or not even that. Mutations can just go and talk to something else altogether, right? And then subscriptions, of course. And so that's kind of what the GraphQL API looks like. Now coming back to kind of the previous question of how does this actually work in how does this actually work, right? Like in an app that I would use. So let me. The easiest way of doing this is, let me go to query and go back to one of that. Let me see if I have one of those older queries lying around.
And just really quick, the graphical part, all is partly shown at the bottom, is something that ships with GraphQL as well. So
yep.
They're cool that they provide.
Yep. Any GraphQL server that you have, you should be able to point. You'll be able to point a graphical type thing to it, right? This was one of the tools that when the Facebook folks open sourced the GraphQL specification, they also open sourced this tool that can understand a GraphQL schema and then kind of show you this tool. And this tool here that we see, the Explorer, that kind of gives me this nice, right, like this click and browse these things. This was built by the folks at OneGraph. OneGraph is another company where they're kind of doing these. They're building GraphQL APIs over SaaS services, over all kinds of SaaS services, right? So they have an open source project that provides this Explorer. So that makes it super convenient to kind of browse the API. But to kind of show you what is actually just happening underneath it, which I find helpful to understand, right? Is when I run this query, let's see what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is you can see this post request here. And so let me see if can I zoom this? All right, I can zoom that. So I'm making a post request. And if I look at what the post request was, right? It's a post request to this endpoint, right? And that's the payload that's sent to it. That's the JSON that's sent to it. There's a JSON called query, right? The keyword, the key, and the value is literally that string, right? That string that I typed in, that's the value, and the response is the JSON, which is expected, which is just like a normal API. The thing that's being sent, the query is sent as a string. It's literally a string that's sent. The server has to understand this string and parse this string and decide what to do. Very similar to building an HTTP server that has to parse the get parameters, right? Like if you have like question mark, limit equal to thing, or first 10 or whatever, or some condition, right? The server has to extract those parameters and parse it. Very similar to that, the server has to parse this GraphQL query, which is why GraphQL servers are a specific thing. They know how to understand these GraphQL queries and parse it, and then figure out what to do. Like, oh, I should go to the database and fetch this data, or I should go to this other data source and fetch this data, right? And that's kind of how it's sent. So now, if you're using this in production, what you would do is, after you kind of try this out in development, and you're like, all right, good, this is the query that I want. You'd go to your application, and then you would actually go and just literally in the simplest way possible, if you wanted to integrate this into your app, in your HTTP client or on your REST client or your whatever API client that you're using, you would say URL is, I don't use Firefox tools usually, but let me.
At the top.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
the URL is this, the method is post, and the body is this thing, where there's a query key and the string. So that's what you send in the client, right? And then in the response, you'll just get the JSON, right? And so that's the simplest way of integrating a GraphQL API into your app. Although now you have kind of GraphQL clients that help you kind of avoid that plumbing. So you don't have to set up the URL and the method and all of those things, because that's the same for everything, right? Whatever query you make, it's going to be the same URL. It's the same endpoint, right? It's always going to be v1/GraphQL. So it's fine, right? Whether it's a mutation, subscription, whatever the query is. So the GraphQL client kind of says, we'll have the same endpoint, we'll have the same post method, and just provide the GraphQL query string And so you write out the GraphQL query string in your whatever .js file, and you say whatever client.query, and it will run this query for you, and then give you that JSON result, right? And so the ergonomics of using it are not as terrible as like copy pasting this string, but it is effectively copy pasting this string. It is not like anything more sophisticated than taking this string and then like copy pasting it into a .js file and saying that's the query that I have. Does that answer the question? Is that what you meant to ask?
Sorry, I'm like, where's my mute button? It totally does. I have one more quick one if you have a sec, or you have something you want to dive into. So I see that we're in v 1.3.2, and I know you're talking about back whenever you first started building it, GraphQL wasn't a thing. How long would you say that like this is
that's a good question. So I would say that Hasura with GraphQL. So when we launched Hasura and we called it Hasura, right? That was in July 2018, and that was alpha, whatever, V1 alpha. And then we had like 40 alpha releases in like 4 months, and then we went into production, and then we had our first stable releases. So that is on. We should see that on. And so yeah, there's been a long number of kind of releases since then. I think like about 80 releases, and all of these releases have been kind of backwards compatible, which is nice because we're evolving so fast and we're adding so many features. But that's been there. But the version that we had of Hasura that we built before GraphQL, this first idea of improving and automating data access by making it declarative is something that I built out, I think, in 2013 on top of Mongo. And it was very different. It wasn't runtime or API powered. I would actually write a file. And in that file, I would specify these are my tables or documents, and these are my permission rules and access control rules. And then I would run a compile step and a build step, kind of very similar to how we build GraphQL servers today. And that was the very, very first incarnation. And then our current head of engineering, my colleague who came, and he's like, this is shit. And he just destroyed, he just destroyed the whole thing, right? He's like,
and you're like, well, thank you. It's my baby, but all right.
Yeah,
tell us how you really feel.
Whole thing. Yeah, really, I feel this is recorded, right? Otherwise, there would be like things there'd be things that I would say. No, I'm just joking. He's amazing. He's helped put this whole thing together, right? But the glint in the eye, the idea was mine. So no, I am. And these are all random statements. So, but I think that was the first version that we built on Mongo, and then Vamshi, who's my colleague, he came along and he's like, let's remove Mongo and let's use Postgres instead. But it's interesting because we're going back full circle. We're going to add support for Mongo as well.
Later this year. Really?
Yeah. So late this year or maybe early next year. But he changed that to Postgres, and we had our own version of GraphQL that we used to call RQL. And at this time, it wasn't Hasura the startup. It was our previous company. It was a consulting firm, right? And we started using this the technology itself with all kinds of people in production to stabilize the tech and whatnot, right? It's Hasura also happens to be written in a language called Haskell, which is a choice for better or worse. So it's an absolutely amazing language to write compilers and the kinds of systems that we do in. But Haskell is a bit of a niche language to put it mildly. And so we built that out. There was a lot of kind of reliability stuff that happened when we started using it with our customers. And then when it got to a certain stage where we were like, you know what, this is good. I think this is a good product now. We shut down our consulting firm. We raised VC. We started Hasura. We added support for GraphQL because if you remember that JSON API that I was trying to show you, it was so terrible that your eyes would start bleeding and you'd be like, oh my goodness, I don't want this API. Like, I get it. I get why this API is cool. I don't want this API. And we're like, okay, fine. We'll do this whole GraphQL thing. I don't understand what the whole fancy thing with GraphQL is, but we'll do it. We'll do it for you. And so we added support for GraphQL. And then, like Justin said, right, GraphQL has types, and it's nice, and it's there's this tooling around it, and
like
it's
slowly
brilliant.
won you over after you got over that painful hump of
exactly. But you catch me on a day where we're not recording and whatever, and I'll have things to say about GraphQL. Like there are nasty things about GraphQL. Let me give you an example of a nasty thing, right? Like, for example, if you have a API kind of monitoring system that looks at API errors, right, and says, oh, there's a non-200, there's a 400, there's a 500, and this is what we should do. And if there's more than 5 errors a minute, it'll send out a pager duty alert. That system isn't going to work with GraphQL, because GraphQL errors are the HTTP code is still 200. The error comes in as a JSON body, right? So let me show you an example of an error, right? Like, let me just do this. Oops. This was the autocomplete.
That's certainly a big challenge, right? Because then all you're really surfacing from that endpoint is like a 500 error, like a failure to the endpoint.
Exactly.
But all those nice HTTP codes that we have that a lot of times we'll interpret on our apps to identify, like not authorized and things like that, you lose out on that.
Exactly.
So is there a workaround, or is it just
nope? There isn't a workaround. There isn't a workaround, and that's what sucks about it. That's what sucks.
You're basically putting that onus on the data that you're returning to represent that HTTP error in some way. So having like a status that says, "Oh, this was unauthorized," and then custom code on the front end to interpret that into what does that mean, right?
Yep. And for now, example, the thing that's monitoring our APIs, right? It can't just look at the error code. It needs to look at the body, right? And the body says, oh, validation failed. This field wasn't typed, so you probably had something wrong in the schema, right? But something needs to go understand this error now. And the problem with that is you're like, what's the big deal? You have to do like a pattern match with the status code, and I'll do a pattern match with something inside the JSON body. The problem is that this kind of breaks a lot of assumptions that we have, and a lot of assumptions that tools have. For example, typically an API monitoring system doesn't peek into the responses of your API, because that's sensitive data, right? So you don't want a third-party tool to come in and look at the responses of your API, because that potentially contains like user-sensitive data, right? So you're giving access to something else to look at the responses of your API. Now that's a whole new kind of security privilege that you have to figure out, right? When you're building these tools and you're setting this integration up together, you're like, oh, but is it okay to give that security access to this monitoring tool, because it's going to look at the responses? What if there's PHI, PII data, right? Like, what if it's sensitive data? What if it's like a credit card thing? What are we going to do then, right? And I mean, we didn't have these problems before, but it's like the entire stack just changed, which is why it's okay for Facebook to do this, because they're like, we'll rebuild the web to get GraphQL, right? I mean, if we can screw around with your elections, this is the least we can do. Sorry, that's not what I was evil. But that's what I mean, right? Like, it's problematic. It's not it opens up a whole new can of worms, right? So our attempt at Hasura has been to say, we'll provide a bunch of these contracts out of the box. Like, we will do that Datadog integration, that Elk integration, that Splunk integration, or whatever is required, right? We'll build that normalized thing, and we'll make that possible out of the box, so that you get the joy of GraphQL without the pain of all of the other new stuff that GraphQL brought in, right? And that's one of the reasons that our point of view is very passionately that GraphQL you should get. You should not have to build, because it's just too complex, right? It's too complex to get everybody to change the way they're doing things. But the API itself is amazing, right? So you want that amazing API, but you don't want to rebuild your entire stack, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But the other thing in terms of like secure information and what have you, and not giving access to that, just because you adopt GraphQL for your application doesn't mean that every piece of your API interaction has to go through GraphQL.
It's a very good point.
So you could have direct HTTP calls to secure APIs for things like credit card or personal information or what have you.
That's a very common pattern that we see, especially with Hasura users, because they're like, we have these REST APIs, they're doing like crazy things, and there's a lot of work that's gone into them. We don't want to touch that, but we do want to be able to read out data better and faster. And so let me stick a Hasura in front of my data sources, configure it, get this nice GraphQL API, start using GraphQL for that portion of the app, continue using the REST APIs for my whatever other portion of the app that I need to, right? And you can start mixing and matching kind of easily, right? And kind of one of the things that I wanted to show you folks was that this authorization layer that is helping you kind of scope in the data you're getting access to is super important, right? Without which even the read side can be too generic, right? So for example, here, if I have the artist table, and when I do a query for artists, I get all of the artists. And the reason why I'm doing that is the reason why that happens is because Hasura runs it in what Hasura calls an admin role. And so you can create a new label, a label called user or a label called artist. And I can say that this user has access only to the data where the artist ID is equal to something like a cookie ID or token ID. Think of it as like you're viewing your own profile. You can't view anybody else's profile. And then you can choose what fields you want to give access to, right? And as soon as you set up that particular rule, when you go apply that rule, right? And I say X Hasura role is user, X Hasura user ID is 1. You'll see that the schema's changed, right? All of the other things have disappeared. I can't even query for them because I only released access for the user, for nothing else. And so now if I run ID and name, remove this ASDF here, I also only get the data that I have access to, right? In the previous version, I was getting access to everything. And so if I make this ID 12, I'm going to get access only to ID 12. And if I subscribe to it, I'll only get events related to this, right? So that's the second critical piece of what you would have done if you would have built your own API, right? If you'd built your own API, you would have basically said, oh, this is user 1 accessing their data. So whenever I make a query to the database, I need to do select star from DB where ID equal to cookie.user ID. And what Hasura is doing is Hasura is basically compiling that into the same query. So that way you're kind of getting access to data. You're only getting access to data that you're supposed to, right? Otherwise it's like a little bit of a party where everybody has everybody's data.
When you talk about building your own API, you're talking about like, if I was to say, I want to use GraphQL. So where do I start? I'm bringing GraphQL in. I maybe have some existing endpoints that I want to unite under my GraphQL, or maybe I have a database already that I want to connect to it. So I'm ready to go. I want to do that. If I do that on my own from scratch, then I'm writing all the code that's implementing everything that you just showed that you're doing it through the UI. So you have to do that as a developer if you're going from the beginning. And so what this solution is providing, saying, hey, look, all the plumbing of connecting it to the database, of understanding the types, of setting up the roles and then the queries and all that stuff, we're giving you a UI experience to do that, so you don't have to write all that complex code.
Exactly, right. And just to kind of show you like a few extension points here, right? Which is because in a lot of cases you're not going to have all of your data in the database, right? I have an example here of me bringing in data from a Stripe API. So what I'm showing you, for example, here I have this thing where I have a table that only has ID and email, and then there's something like a Stripe token. And there's other data that belongs to this user, but it's in Stripe. It's not in our database, like their saved cards or their order history or something. And so I've brought in the Stripe API as a remote schema, as another data source with something like OneGraph, right? Or I can bring in a Shopify GraphQL API or a GitHub GraphQL API, whatever. So I brought that in as a data source, just like I have a database as a data source. And then I can set up relationships, like I have relationships between tables. I can set up relationships between like a table and another API. So I've set up a relationship here, and I'm saying that my table's Stripe customer ID column is the Stripe API's customer ID field. That's the relationship. Now that's all I specify, right? As JSON via the UI, whatever. I specify that, and then Hasura creates the GraphQL schema from that and says, hey, here's a GraphQL schema where I let you fetch ID and email, but I'll also let you fetch all the Stripe data, right? So if I run this query, you'll see that the email and ID stuff is coming from our database, but this data is coming in from Stripe, right? And this is the kind of stuff that you would have had to do. And this is work that nobody should be doing. It's 2020, right? It's the end of 2020 almost, in fact. But nobody wants to do this. And this is just bringing in data from other places, it's joining data from different places, setting up security rules, and that's fine. And then I can start using the data to build more to do actually useful things for the user, right? And that's kind of how Hasura does this. So you can bring in a REST API as well. You can attach an existing REST endpoint, and that will come into your GraphQL. a schema. So Hasura supports these different kinds of sources, and these different sources can kind of be brought in to create the GraphQL API and to secure it and do all kinds of things there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what, like when you say, hey, one of the benefits of GraphQL is the ability to bring in multiple sources into one query.
Exactly.
Okay, I want that. I want GraphQL with that. Now you have to wire it up. And so now that's that next step of this is like, boom, let's make that, more straightforward for you. So you can spend more time building your app and less time doing the connectivity, which can be automated and built through Hasura.
Yep.
Awesome. Yep.
But yeah, that's
shut up and take my money.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we're at the top of the hour already. What I would love to have another episode.
Oh, I didn't mean shut up literally. I just
There's a chat question. Do we have time for it? Yeah, maybe?
Yeah, but let me throw this out real quick. I would love to have another episode.
Well, Tanmai talks really fast, so
I would love to have another episode where we continue on this topic of from the Angular side of using Angular now. So how do we take an Angular app and work with Hasura and see it all kind of come together? That'd be awesome.
Yep. That'd be so wonderful if you could come on again. I would love
let's figure that out.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Okay, but yeah, now 2 chat questions, totally wide. So don't know if you can blaze through them.
Remember, Rares, we're bringing him with us to the community hangout after this.
Asking if subscriptions are also available with multiple backend instances.
Yes. Okay. That's what I have to say.
That's perfect. That's perfect.
And then I want to expand on that. So if your API that you're hitting with that and you have a subscription, are you then setting up some sort of internal polling to make calls to that server, or potentially, if it's available, a WebSocket communication with that API?
Exactly. So we hook into whatever, whenever we add a data source, right? We understand what is called a CDC mechanism, a change data capture mechanism that data source supports. So different data sources support different kinds of CDCs. So whenever you bring in a Postgres, Hasura kind of uses Postgres specific CDC methods to set that up with Postgres, right? But if you have another kind of different data source, you might not have the same things, right? So the adapter that Hasura has for that data source is going to be different.
I love it. Sorry, listen.
No, Rares just said, what about the security on all that API? How do we set that there's no need to allow other users to see the last 4 numbers of a card?
Yep. So there is, so for example, if you want to remove all of those things, you can set, like I showed you on the UI there. Let me share my screen again super quickly.
You're able to set that up on your GraphQL side to map data, right? That's going to get returned in a certain way.
Exactly that. And you can also choose that you only want to expose certain fields, right? So you can say that, I don't want to expose name. And so when you go set up the permissions for that, you can say, I don't want this field to appear, right? And you can do that. And you can do this with whatever data source you have. So if you're bringing in a Stripe thing, you'll be like, oh, you know what? I don't want this field at all, right? And then there is this, there's kind of like more advanced things here, right? Like, for example, you have computed fields where that field does not really exist, but it's computed on the fly. And so you can set up a computed field as well. And you can be like, I don't have name, but I have first name, or I have initials or something. And then that will come in through Hasura. So there's a bunch of things that you can do there, but essentially you have the 2 models of security are what we call row level security, like entity level security, which is the rule that I have here, right? It's the rule that decides what entities I have access to, right? I have access to artists, but which artists in particular do I actually get to see, right? Like if it's a document, I can say I want document, if document.editors contains me, or document.viewers contains me, or document is public, right? So that's the set of conditions that describes whether I have access to that particular entity. So that's like entity level permissions. And then you have kind of field level permissions, which tell you whether you have access to certain fields or not, right? And so then you can decide what subset of fields you want to display for different users and for different kind of roles. And then you can combine multiple roles together to create hierarchies and whatnot. And those kinds of like things that inevitably end up happening in the real world quagmire kind of situation that we all inevitably live in. A little bit of darkness there, but yeah.
Awesome.
And so with that, because I saw you, there was a feature to be able to limit the number of rows there. You don't have to go back to it.
Yep.
Yeah. Can this is just a GraphQL specific question because I haven't used it really at all. Does it have the ability to do paging? So if you have some like an infinite scroll or a paged grid or something like that to be able to do that. Perfect.
Yep. That's super important, right? For all of these list type queries. Yeah.
Especially for all artists that have an album that contains the word rock. I mean, it's going to be more than one page.
This is true.
Or the artist with a large catalog of albums, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, I guess we better get into picks and then wrap it up. Any last comment or anything on the content? Let's do that. If there's anything left. Tanmai, you want to say anything or anything left?
From my side, whoever's watching this, folks, would love for you to try Hasura out. It's open source, run it wherever. We have a cloud offering as well. Run it on our cloud, run it on your cloud, run it on your laptop. Give us feedback. We have a super active Discord community. Join us there. Tell us if you're struggling with things. Tell us if you have any questions or any things that you want improved. We're always there. And then, of course, if you have any other questions on GraphQL or Hasura or anything at all, I'm Tanmai on Twitter, so I'm happy to take questions there as well. And looking forward to the next version of this where we can dive into kind of more Angular specific data fetching things.
Yeah, there's lots of positive feedback in the chat about how wonderful this was, and lots of anticipation for that integration with Angular. So,
thank you.
Nice.
Thank you.
Well, I know I
told you guys were going to like him.
Yeah, I'm going to plan my weekend around diving into this. It's too exciting to not jump into right away. Let's do some picks. So, our panelists, we got any picks? Who's got picks?
Mike has a pick. Well, I think we all have picks. Go ahead, Mike.
I'll go first. Mine, I don't want this to be political, but if you have your voice, go vote. Regardless of party affiliation or anything else, very important to be able to use your voice to vote if you can.
Vote, for sure.
Yep.
Thanks,
I second that. Okay, I have a couple of quick picks. I was looking at the calendar. Okay, so first of all, right after the show, like right now, we're bringing this guy, Tanmai, is going with us to community office hours on Angular Nation. So if you haven't joined Angular Nation, just put in your email and I know because the camera's backwards. I will go and approve any new requests to join right now. And then we're going to go and he's going to come and talk to us and answer more questions in Community Hangout. And also, I wanted to mention we have we're out of time, but there are a bunch of events coming up in the next couple of weeks, including Alyssa's Dev Reach, which we're all going to be participating in. So, yeah. And we have a lot of stuff coming up on the calendar.
I'm so excited. That segues perfectly into my pick. I'll be putting the link in the chat, but it is to DevReach. It's in 2 weeks. And it's like a day packed with speakers. We're doing a really unique event called the Angular Relay. So we'll be doing personal interviews for the first half of their 25-minute session. And then during the last half, they'll be tacking on something of their own to the Tour of Heroes demo that I have modified with My Little Pony. And this crew right here, the AngularAir crew, will be on for a brunch break, although it's not brunch everywhere, but it'll be our brunch break in the US at least, for a mukbang, which I don't think any of us have ever been a part of. So it's going to be epic. It's going to be great. So. And it's free. So join us.
I love free stuff.
Really. And yeah, that brunch time for me on the Pacific time zone is a little early. So it'll kind of be my wake up time, but
you'll be like sipping the coffee.
Right.
It'll be your breakfast and my dinner and everybody else's brunch. But it'll be fun though.
The food has to be messy though. Is the food going to be messy? It has to be like sloppy Joe burgers and
I think the people, the wonderful women behind the scenes, they had a couple plans. I know Uber Eats, like sending out Uber Eats gift cards was one of them, but I know that Uber Eats is not where Bonnie is. So I think they had a snack box plan to mail out. So we'll see what we all get in the mail.
Specific requests
I have no idea
because there are certain things that we can't get here. So that will be very, very exciting. Reese's, did you know they don't have Reese's Pieces in Europe?
So I heard that was a thing, that like peanut butter and chocolate isn't a very popular like combo outside of the US. Like
you can get it in a truffle, but not like the Reese's Pieces.
Yes, as somebody who has recently moved to the US, I shall second this. There is a peanut butter in X kind of situation that is happening in the US that everybody else is not subscribed to. Nobody else, people have not subscribed to this peanut butter and X thing that is happening. That's a huge thing. Everybody else is like, wait, what? Even is this even legal? Right? Peanut butter and jam? No.
My friends in Bulgaria, they'll have us bring things like specific peanut butter and X things when we come and visit them. So that is so fun. I didn't know that was a specific US thing. Interesting. The more you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love how the description is a very engineering dev type of thing in X, right? You got this one thing in a variant of things. It's awesome.
All right. We got to run.
I have a pick. I don't normally have.
Yeah.
I have a pick this time, but actually I don't even remember if I picked this on a previous episode. There's been so many episodes, but I'm picking it again if I have. And it's Bundlephobia. It's a website where you can go and you can type in an NPM package and it'll tell you all the dependencies it has on it and the size and the impact. So I'll throw it in the chat here. But I love it because then you're kind of like always when we determine like, do we want to bring this third-party code into our application? What's the impact? You can go here and you can get that quick visual of
that's so cool.
What's the size? What's the gzip size? And then also what other packages, what other dev dependencies or dependencies does it have? And it shows you that right there. So super awesome. That's my pick.
Very cool.
Tanmai, do you have any pick for us before we wrap up?
Yeah, I have very recently started reading something that has been on my list for a long time. It's What If by Randall Munroe by the XKCD author. If you haven't read it, it is just the most hilarious thing. It's just amazing. It'll just like bring out the child in you all over again. It's basically like lots of arbitrary questions that he like really just tries to scientifically answer. Like, what if all of the human beings got together on Rhode Island and then just jumped together? Will the Earth move? Right?
Yeah, no, it's actually really cool, like scientific answers to these ridiculous questions. And he breaks it down so anybody can understand it. But it's like this deep rabbit hole that you go down. It's an epic journey. If you haven't heard of What If, I will back you so hard. Go and read one. They're epic.
It's amazing. You should read it.
Well, now I've got two things to do on my list for this weekend, and a couple other plans I already have. And I'm going to add that.
Justin.
Got to make time. Got to program time somehow.
Also, Mike, you look upset. Did we upset you with our pick? Your face is so stoic right now.
He's reading the book already.
No.
He's installing Hasura.
I was looking for something in reference to Justin's pick because it made me think of another pick. And I was looking for a reference. So Justin's talking about the bundle size of dependencies. But the promising things that Ben Lush has been tweeting about RxJS 8, like drastic size differences for RxJS 8 when that comes out. I think it might be in beta. I'm not positive the current state, so don't take me for that. But go look up his tweets on RxJS 8. A lot of size decreases from that library with performance gains too.
Nice. All right. Well, hey, Tanmai, thanks a ton for coming on, for sharing your time, sharing your knowledge with us, teaching us this stuff. Also, everything that you've done with Hasura and all that stuff. We really appreciate it and super looking forward to having you on again for sure. So thank you.
Thanks so much, folks. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, that's a wrap. Take it easy, everyone. Remember to go over to Angular Nation for the follow-up discussion. See ya.
Bye.
Mwah.